Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon to participate in the 100 Days Speaker Series program and conversation. My name is Grace Wilkins. I'm a member of the class of 2026 studying economics and Italian, and I'm Vice President of Operations for the Dartmouth Political Union. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's 100 Days Speaker Series program. The 100 Days Speaker Series builds on Dartmouth's commitment to bring diverse perspectives and expertise to our institution as we discuss focal policy areas impacted by the presidential transition. This series is a first of its kind and unique in that it was collaboratively created by the Dartmouth Rockefeller Center, Dartmouth Democrats, Dartmouth Conservatives, and the Dartmouth Political Union in cooperation with Dartmouth Dialogues with the primary goal of fostering bipartisan conversation on key issues during the first 100 days of the presidential administration. All aspects of the planning, from identifying topics and speakers to determining moderator questions, have been student-driven to help make sure that these conversations are as relevant as possible to our student body. We're so grateful to campus partners who have joined us and brought enormous time, effort, and care to making this series happen. Today's program is being co-sponsored by the Dartmouth Revers Center for Energy, Sustainability, and Innovation, the Arthur L. Irving Institute for Energy and Society, the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and the Social Sciences, the Center for Business, Government, and Society at Tuck, and Dartmouth Dialogues, in collaboration with the Dartmouth Democrats, Dartmouth Conservatives, and the Dartmouth Political Union. We would like to welcome our virtual attendees who are joining us today via live stream. For those joining us in person, when we reach the audience Q&A portion of our program, you can raise your hand and one of our student assistants will bring you a microphone. Please be sure to wait for the microphone before speaking to make sure that everyone in the room and on our live stream can hear you. As a reminder, Dartmouth is committed to protecting free expression and peaceful dissent. We ask that you do not interfere or disrupt today's program, which would include preventing attendees from seeing or hearing our guest and moderator, or interfering with our guest and moderator's ability to speak and be heard. With that, I'd like to welcome Jonathan Silverthorne, Director of the Revers Center for Energy, Sustainability, and Innovation, to share a few words and introduce our guest speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you all for joining tonight. As Grace mentioned, tonight's event is a result of months of planning across 4 different centers and institutes at Dartmouth. We organized the event recognizing that energy policy has taken center stage, not only in national policy discussions in Washington, where President Trump declared a national energy emergency on his first day in office, but also in state capitals, corporate boardrooms, small businesses, and homes across the country. Energy is an essential service that powers the U.S. economy and industry, including emerging as one of the biggest factors shaping the pace and scale of the growth of artificial intelligence. The sector employs approximately 8 million Americans. It's also one of the largest contributors of greenhouse gas emissions, raising concerns and debates around the importance of addressing climate change. And as much value as it provides in our lives, it can be a source of stress for millions of Americans who have seen their electricity, home heating, and transportation costs increase significantly in the last few years. At times, it's a bipartisan issue, and at times, it's sharply political. Given that, we're delighted to have 2 distinguished speakers joining us tonight to unpack what we've seen in the first 100, I actually counted 78 days, since the start of the administration, and what lies ahead for U.S. energy policy and the energy industry. Our first panelist, Secretary Dan Brouillette, began his career as a tank commander in the U.S. Army and working on energy pipelines. He has extensive private sector experience, including senior corporate roles at Ford and USAA. In 2017, he joined the Trump administration, first as Deputy Secretary and then as Secretary of Energy, the only person confirmed to both roles. After the Department of Energy, he served as President of Sempra Infrastructure, overseeing multi-billion-dollar investments in LNG and other energy projects. Currently, among other roles, he is the Senior Energy Advisor to the recently announced $500 billion Stargate project led by SoftBank, OpenAI, and Oracle. Our second panelist, Kevin Knobloch, began his career as a journalist and Democratic congressional speaker, with a strong focus on climate and clean energy. From 2000 to 2013, he led the Union of Concerned Scientists, a leading national nonprofit focused on environmental sustainability, among other key topics. From there, he joined the Obama administration as Chief of Staff to Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz for close to 4 years. After DOE, he served as president of New York Ocean Grid LLC, developing offshore wind transmission, and as CEO of Greentown Labs, the nation's largest climate tech incubator. He's currently the president of Knobloch Energy and a general partner of London Green City. Our faculty moderator tonight is Professor Charlie Whelan, who among his many hats is a professor of business administration at Tuck, faculty director of the Center for Business, Government, and Society, and a Dartmouth alumnus. And finally, in keeping with the spirit of the 100 Days series, we're also delighted to have 3 students on stage helping steer the discussion, including John Coleman, Dartmouth class of 26, who is the vice president of the Dartmouth Conservatives and a history government double major, Fiona Hood, also 26, the communications director for the Dartmouth Democrats and a government Middle East studies double major, and Nolan Mayhew, Tuck 25, a US Air Force veteran who right before Tuck served as National Security Advisor to Iowa Senator Joni Ernst. It was a lot of introductions, so please, with that, join me in welcoming our speakers and moderators to the stage.
Thank you both for joining us, and thanks to all of you for coming out to here. It's wonderful to have this panel and to have students here to share input. I'm going to start with kind of a 30,000-foot question. We'll start with Secretary, and then we'll have Mr. Knobloch comment. Just describe the energy landscape as you see it for us, where supply is coming from, where demand is going, and probably how that has evolved in the recent past, and maybe how you think it's going to change.
Sure. Well, Charlie, let me start by thanking you and the entire team here for the opportunity to be with you. And thank you, all of you out in the audience, for joining us tonight. I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion. And I'm really honored to be here at Dartmouth. I grew up in the southern part of the United States, down in New Orleans. I would never have dreamed of coming to Dartmouth. So it's an honor for me to be here today. It's a big question, Charlie. A lot has happened, frankly, in my lifetime. When I first started out in the energy business, I was a pipeline welder, as Jonathan mentioned earlier. And I welded a lot of 42-inch pipe from New Orleans to Houston. And a lot of that pipe was to import energy into the United States, natural gas and crude oil in some instances. And that's fundamentally changed in the last 30, 40 years. We are now the world's largest producer of oil and gas. We're the world's largest producer of energy, I would dare say, overall. So a lot has happened in that 40 or 45-year period. What has also happened is that the demand for energy has increased dramatically. We have read about the stories of data centers and AI and the tremendous amount of energy that they will consume, electrons primarily. That's true. And I want to put that in context for those of you who don't live your daily lives thinking about electricity or thinking about electrons. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is an agency down in Washington, D.C. that has a dotted line connected to the U.S. Department of Energy, has indicated that by 2028, don't hold me to this, but roughly 2028, perhaps 2030, we're going to be short on electricity, short on electrons by about 28 to 30 gigawatts. And that's without the AI demand, according to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So to put that in context, New York City uses about 6 gigawatts per day of electricity. So what they're saying is, without doing anything at all, we have to build roughly 5 New York City-sized grids in order to meet the current demand. When you look at what AI will add to the grid, we have to move to a different scale because it moves to terawatt hours. The estimates there is over the next decade, just the AI demand alone will add roughly 200 terawatt hours of electricity demand to the US grid. To put that in context or to give you some sense of scale, that's more energy than the state of Texas produced all of last year. So we're about to add another Texas-sized load to our US grid. That begs a bunch of questions. How do you do this? With what source? You know, are we going to use what we've always used? Are we going to use natural gas to produce electrons? Are we going to use nuclear power? Are we going to use battery storage combined with renewable power? Those are fundamental questions, and it's not just what type of energy we will use, it's what's available to us and what hurdles stand in the way of that energy production. As I just said, we're going to be short on electrons over the course of the next 4 to 5 years. Today in the United States, on average, to build any sort of energy project, it will take 4 to 5 years to get the permit to build the project. Not to build the project, just to get the permit to build the project. So we're starting to see, in very acute terms, a timing mismatch between what we want and what we can do and the structures and the hurdles that may stand in the way of those goals. So it's a very important conversation that we're having in the country today, and I think one that's going to determine our future both on the economic side of the equation and I dare say on the national security side as well.
So, Mr. Knobloch, what would you add or flesh out in that description?
Well, first of all, Charlie, thank you again for including me in this discussion. It's an honor to be on a panel with Secretary Brouillette. You know, we were talking earlier over the course of the day about the energy transition. Our energy economy in this country has always been in transition. If you go back to the earliest days of Dartmouth College, we had a wood-based energy economy. And then we moved to coal, and of course oil, and those early fossil sources built our industry, built our wealth, and then we moved from there on to the modern era when we're investing much more in what I would call clean energy, but irrespective of whether you want to call it clean energy or not, to wind, solar, storage, geothermal energy, and so on. And here we are, we're in transition again. Now what's different now as compared to the colonial times or World War II times is climate change. We now understand that, that emitting greenhouse gases is warming our climate and changing our climate. And we also understand that we have limited time to decarbonize our economy. It's exciting, a lot of what's been happening, even as it hasn't been a smooth ride. Cost of energy, as was mentioned earlier, is up. Affordability is a real issue. There's some real concerns. There's concerns about how you take intermittent energy and you fold it in. But what I will say, by way of closing this particular answer, is that we were starting from a standing position, 0, in terms of wind and solar, et cetera. And today it accounts for 17% of our energy mix, not counting nuclear, if you want to, do. And today, one of the introducers talked about 8 million energy jobs in this country. 500,000 of those jobs come from wind and solar and geothermal and storage and EV, manufacturing EV cars and EV batteries. So we're well underway, and I'm sure over the course of our discussion we'll drill down on some of those things. But this notion that this is a one-off transition, just doesn't actually reflect history. We're always going to be growing and changing and evolving our energy mix. And Dan is correct, where the energy demand is really increasing. It wasn't that long ago, I would even guess 10, 15 years ago, when the energy utilities, the electric utilities, were projecting a decrease in demand.
That's right.
And they were looking, with wistful eyes toward widespread deployment of EVs, of electric vehicles, to fill some of that need. Now, of course, we understand with data centers having a voracious energy appetite, now we're looking at growing energy demand.
So we've touched on the economic challenges, we've touched on the environmental challenges. While we're still up at 20,000 feet, if you could each talk a little bit about how our evolving energy landscape affects the geopolitics of the world. I mean, we're old enough to remember the Arab embargo. We weren't old then, but remember.
You're old enough
But
to remember.
if you could touch on how the shifting production to the U.S. matters, but also at the same time we need rare earths for battery technology and other kinds of things. So if we could start with you, Mr. Knobloch, how this energy environment shapes the way we look at the rest of the world.
I guess, Charlie, I would start by saying, if you, again, you go back 10, 20 years when we were hyper-dependent on imported oil. We were consuming 20 million barrels of oil a day, and we were importing 16 million barrels, something on that scale. We've flipped that. And that has to do with technology, innovation and advancement, fracking, technology for both oil and gas, and investment in bringing those fossil fuels to the surface. We now produce 21 million barrels of oil a day, and the next largest producer of oil in the world, Saudi Arabia, is half that, and then it goes down from there. It's a remarkable thing. Now, again, you have to look at that in the eyes of, can we sustain that? It's a good thing from national security perspective. It's a good thing from a jobs perspective in many parts of the country, and creating wealth. Can we sustain that in a carbon-constrained world? And that's where investing in carbon capture, carbon utilization, carbon storage comes in a very big way. Can we really get on top of methane leaks at the well level and at the pipeline distribution level? That methane is 25 times more intensive as a greenhouse gas than carbon. That's a problem that's right there ready to solve, and the big oil and gas majors have the engineering and the technology to do that. Let me stop there. Hand it to Dan.
Secretary, geopolitics?
Geopolitics of energy. I'll just share my personal experience. So, almost 25 years ago, I guess, I first came to the U.S. Department of Energy through a nomination by President George W. Bush to be an Assistant Secretary of Energy. And that's sort of a mid-level position within the department. It's Senate confirmed, but it's mid-management, if you will, in that department. And I was nominated in February of 2001. And because of the makeup of the Senate at the time, it flipped. So Republicans were in charge of the Senate. We went through part of the confirmation process. And then someone who I forget now, I think, flipped parties, and it went to Democratic control. So Mr. Daschle became the Senate Majority Leader, and we had to start the process all over again. Long story short, I wasn't really confirmed for that role until about early August of that year. September 11th, 2001, 30 days later or so after my confirmation, changed our world dramatically. It also changed the energy space dramatically as well, because I was one of the few confirmed members of the U.S. Department of Energy at that point in time, so I had a lot of meetings that were related to things that I didn't have direct control over in the department, to be honest. But I watched President Bush tiptoe around a few issues that were related to the 9/11 events, and in particular, some of the Middle Eastern countries. And he had to tiptoe around them because, again, we weren't the strong energy producer that we are today. Fast forward 20 plus years, I am now the Secretary of Energy, and we are in the middle of a pandemic, and we're dealing with the fallout of that pandemic. We're watching governments protect people from an enormously contagious virus that is producing deaths, not only here in the United States, but around the world. And as a result, we are not using energy as much as we were just a few weeks earlier. So much so that oil prices went negative. Negative $37 a barrel was what.
But you had to take delivery.
But you had to take delivery. You had to take delivery. President Trump called me right after we saw the demand curves, go off the edge of the cliff, and I didn't know it at the time, but the Saudis and the Russians were in a bit of a tiff within OPEC Plus over production numbers. Who was going to produce more, and were they going to cut, not cut, what was going to be the pricing, that sort of thing. So the president asked me at the time, he said, call your counterpart in Saudi Arabia, who I know very well. His Royal Highness, Prince Abdulaziz, is a friend of mine. I've worked with him for a number of years, as was the energy minister in Russia, Alex Novak, at the time. And he said, work this out. They have to cut production because we're going to have too much oil, and it's going to really hurt, the producers here in the United States. So for about 30 days, I worked 30 hours a day trying to work this out with the Saudis and the Russians. And they were doing this, as you might imagine. It's his fault, it's her fault, it's somebody else's fault, not mine. That was the crux of the conversation. So I called the president back at some point, and I said, Mr. President, I've done all I can do at the ministerial level, the secretarial level, to work this out. I really think it's going to be a head of state conversation that needs to occur. And in typical Donald Trump, fashion, he said, okay, great, come on over, we'll do it right now. And I said, right now? He said, yeah, right now. So I picked up everything, I ran over to the Oval Office. He looked over at Molly, after I briefed him, he looked over at Molly at the front desk, and he said, let's get Mr. Putin on the phone. Mr. Putin comes on the phone. He said, let's get the king on the phone. Mr. King comes on the phone. He puts a tri-party call together, and within about 40 minutes or so, he was able to reach an agreement to have OPEC plus countries reduce their production by roughly 10 million barrels a day. And I thought to myself going home that evening, how fundamentally different that is than the situation we dealt with 20 years earlier under President George Bush. He just didn't have that option. And President Trump had that option of that incredible energy production here in the United States. It allowed him to negotiate that from a position of strength. And as I think about the future of energy here in the United States, Kevin's absolutely right. At some point, we're going to have to be innovative and figure out how do we mitigate carbon emissions from these sources of energy. We have to do that. But we also have to develop new sources of energy. And that may come in the form of small modular reactors or advanced reactors for nuclear technologies, or it may be something we haven't even thought of today. We just don't know. But it's important we do that because as I mentioned, to a number of different audiences, most recently I think it was a CNBC audience, energy is fundamental to everything that we do. And when we think about it, as Kevin alluded to earlier, it makes up today roughly 5%, 6% maybe of our gross domestic product, GDP. But importantly, it's the first 6%. Everything that we do here in our daily lives depends on the provision of energy. So that's the economic security part of this equation. But that national security, that geopolitical security component of energy production is equally important, in my view, for our nation to go forward. So I'm excited about the future for energy production. I just think it has to increase faster than what we've done in the last few years.
I was trained by economists, and we've come to the point in the program where I advocate for a carbon tax. In theory, everybody should love it, right? Republicans should love it because we're not going to be throwing subsidies different places. We're just going to make carbon-based fuels more expensive and then let the market work its wonders. Democrats could love it because it's the most powerful and all-encompassing way to reduce carbon emissions, and yet it is one thing that brings Republicans and Democrats together because they hate it. So tell me why I'm wrong on the carbon tax. Or agree with me.
Carbon taxes are hard. I mean, my undergraduate work was in economics. I am not a professional economist, so please forgive me for that. But it's hard in my mind to understand how a carbon tax is all that different than a tariff. So when we talk about border adjustments, for instance, on carbon intensity, what a country is really saying is that I'm going to place a duty on your product because I think it is more carbon intense than it needs to be, or more carbon intense than what I want in my country. So to me, it looks like a tariff or a tax, which it is. The second part I think that Republicans sometimes have trouble with is who gets to set the price. And I heard your comment where the market sets the price. There's going to be a trading mechanism where people can buy and sell either credits or some other vehicle. And through that market mechanism, they'll set a price. But somebody has to set the first price. Somebody has to kickstart this thing. There has to be a rate, a tax rate of some sort. So who gets to set that? And how easily is that adjusted? Because as we're seeing today with the tariff conversation, folks are somewhat uncomfortable with the government deciding with, in some cases, less transparency than people would like. What's that rate going to be? Is it going to be 10%, 15%, 30%, 100%? And from as a former president of an infrastructure company, that certainty is necessary. We're talking about enormous investments here. The LNG facility that I developed down in Port Arthur, Texas, was a $15 billion facility, and it was financed with 20-year long-term contracts by off-takers. So before you make those types of decisions, you want to have at least some level of certainty as to what that regulatory field is going to look like or what that tax field is going to look like. So from a Republican standpoint, I think that is at least part of the basis of their objection. For Democrats, I don't know what the objection would be.
Well,
I'll
we're
leave
about
that
to
to
find
Kevin. I'll leave that to Kevin.
I am going to disappoint you, and carbon tax is not my favorite, but I'm going to offer a similar, better alternative. But before I do that, I want to observe that behind your question is how do we, in a big complex economy like this, in a democracy, how do we affect meaningful and lasting change? And in my experience, it's typically through legislation, through the process and the act of hearings and looking for the best ideas, and then incorporating them into a statute. If you look at, and again, along this wonderful day, we were talking a bit about this. If you look at coal-fired power plants, and there are still a number of them operating today and generating electricity today, they are so much more cleaner than they would have been without the Clean Air Act, without the laws to mandate that they had to control the release of mercury, of particulates, of SOx and NOx. It's a remarkable story. It's why people want to come to this country from all over the globe, in part because of our wonderful, healthy environment and economy, which is linked. And so in that respect, I think what we have been missing in the response to climate change and the effort to decarbonize every sector has been significant and durable legislation. What you saw during, first, when I was serving under President Obama and Secretary Moniz, and then more robustly under President Biden, was the incentive route, the bipartisan infrastructure law that Congress passed, bipartisan in just the skinniest way, providing hundreds of billions of dollars of grants across, by the way, an all of the above agenda. The Inflation Reduction Act, providing generous tax credits, clean energy tax credits across the economy, and significantly increasing debt financing from the DOE loan program. That's incentive-based, and it's getting some pretty good results. That's not durable. That's not lasting. So where that brings me, Charlie, is to cap and trade. Now, the cap and trade idea was a Republican idea to start out. And it was, the notion was if we're going to somehow induce reduction of greenhouse gases emissions in the economy, how do we make it so it's done in a most efficient way? The cap, you based on the best science you can come up with, you set a cap on overall emissions across the economy. You ratchet that cap down over time, and you try to build in a pace that the economy can respond to. And then you allow any emitter that can reduce at a faster pace to get credit and to be able to sell those credits to the industries and the players that can't reduce emissions cost effectively as fast, so they can buy the right to pollute. Now, many of my brothers and sisters in the environmental community had trouble with that. You know, we're going to pay polluters to keep on polluting. And they lost the story, which is a cap coming down over time. My experience, it's a strong policy that has been tried, by the way, in various parts of the country, various regions of the country, including New England. To me, that's preferable to a carbon tax, because a carbon tax, from the literature I've read, you have to put that carbon tax so high to induce the behavioral changes that you want. Think about going to the pump. You know, you'd really have to put it up there. And not to mention that gas prices are one of those sensitive things that we really respond to in the economy and do not like when we have to pay a lot more. So anyway, that's my pitch for cap and trade.
We'd make the economists happy if carbon cost anything in any way.
Yes.
But you both mentioned a lot of technologies. You kind of ran through a whole bunch of everything from carbon capture to nuclear. So I'm going to turn to Nolan, representing our business contingent, to kind of go down that road a little bit.
Thanks, Charlie, and thank you all for your questions. We had a lot of really good questions written in, so many about emerging technologies in energy. Some of them already mentioned: direct air capture, CCUS, small modular reactors. geothermal, green and blue hydrogen. If you had to predict an emerging energy source or a technology that could become commercial in the next 5 years, what would you put your money on, starting with you, Mr. Secretary?
Oh man, you put me on the spot. I was hoping to go to Kevin first. give me a minute to think about it. In the next 5 years, you said?
Yeah,
5 years?
10.
Or 10, 5 or 10? Okay. I'm gonna take a couple long shot bets here. I'll give you two that I think in the next 10 years, let's call it 10 years. Geothermal technologies, I think, are gonna come to the fore and be commercially viable very fast. And that's based on the previous work. Kevin mentioned the technologies that were developed in part by the Department of Energy, as well as the private sector, people like George Mitchell, and that's hydraulic fracturing. Today, we can get to places in the subsurface of the earth that we couldn't have dreamed of getting to 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, certainly. And I think that's gonna open up a lot of activity and a lot of investment. We're already seeing that in parts of the country today. Utah in particular has a very good project that's gonna power a significant amount of their electricity load through geothermal power. It's clean, it's not 100% carbon free, but it is largely carbon free. And I just think, again, I think the world is gonna change on the basis of that. The other is gonna be advanced reactors, and I wanna distinguish that from small modular reactors. Two different things here. Small modular reactors, and this is an oversimplification, so for all of you who are in the engineering program here, I apologize in advance. They're just miniaturizing the current technologies that we have today. Pressure water reactors, boiling water reactors, making them smaller, and putting out blocks of reactors rather than giant reactors that are typically made by American companies, Westinghouse in particular, and AP1000. The advanced reactors are fundamentally different because they use an entirely different type of fuel source. And why that is important is because of what it represents to both customer acceptance and non-proliferation. So there are companies in the country today, like X-Energy in Rockville, Maryland, that have developed fuel sources for these small advanced reactors that are accident tolerant. So for instance, if you lost the cooling system in a reactor, it wouldn't release radiation into the environment because of the way it's designed and the way the fuel is encapsulated itself. It just doesn't have the ability to become a Chernobyl or anything else that you might think of when most people think of nuclear reactors. So it answers fundamentally for the customer a safety concern that we have experienced here in the United States and in other parts of the world as well, Japan in particular, and obviously Russia. But if we can solve that equation and increase consumer acceptance of that technology, I think it will, one, increase the investment in those technologies, which will lead to supply chain development and other things that you need. The second part of this on advanced reactors, the reason why it's important is because the fuel source that I just described cannot be used to make a warhead. So this technology, nuclear technologies generally, is a dual-use technology. It's very, very important for our energy sources here, but it's also dangerous in that sense. So if we can solve those two with these advanced fuels and these advanced reactors, then I think we'll see those come online in the next decade.
Mr. Knobloch?
Well, first of all, I applaud, I like your two technologies, Dan, geothermal and SMRs. The two I would offer, one is fusion. Now, throughout my life and career, fusion has always been 20 years away. It feels to me like maybe it's 10 years away now. Part of the evidence for that, I think, first of all, there's been some important technology breakthroughs. But secondly, the private sector has gotten into the game. This used to be a national lab avocation, and now there's any number of significant investors coming into space and early to mid-stage companies developing fusion technology. Now, part of that's maybe wistful because we need, we need every tool in the toolbox on this enterprise, both in terms of to meet increasing energy demand and to decarbonize, the economy. But I've been tracking fusion a little closely and encourage others too as well. I think there's, if we can break through there, that's going to bring a lot of additional important zero carbon firepower to the table. The other is green hydrogen. In the bipartisan infrastructure law, Congress, and this was engineered in great part by Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, just retired independent, provided, I want to say $8 or $10 billion for a series of regional hydrogen hubs. And then they ran a competition across the country. And regions banded together to bid on these regional hydrogen hubs. And the way Congress designed it, they weren't trying to pick winners and winners per se, but they said, DOE, of the awards you give, these grants for these regional hydrogen hubs, we want one to have a nuclear component. Nuclear is generating the hydrogen. Another natural gas, another renewable energy, and so on. So they wanted to bring some diversity into it. And the brilliance of it was they required any winning regional hub had to be soup to nuts. You had to show within your region that you could generate the hydrogen, you could distribute it and transport it, and then your end users would be using it in region. Now, hydrogen is generally thought to be an important solution to the hard to decarbonize sectors. Marine shipping, where you can convert it to ammonia, long-haul heavy-duty trucking, iron making, and you can do some electricity generation balancing with it. And that's an important contribution, because we're figuring out passenger vehicles with hybrids and EVs and so on. But what those hard to decarbonize sectors we're struggling with. So I would offer that as my second.
Can I add just something real quick on the fusion point that you just made? Because I think this is important. How many in the audience, do we have any fusion engineers here, any nuclear engineers? I don't see many hands going up.
Just kind of as a hobby.
You do, yeah. Good Saturday morning, maybe, instead of golf, you play with the fusion reactor. Fusion technology is very important, and Kevin alluded to it. We have had some amazing breakthroughs in the last few months and years, and a lot of this is due to the good work that Kevin and his former boss, Ernie Moniz, started. He mentioned two companies, or he mentioned private sector companies that are doing this. One of them is right here, right down the road at MIT, Commonwealth, who's doing some great work at the university there, and I dare say that we'll see them go public very, very soon, and another out in San Diego, General Atomics. But importantly, under the previous administration, what began as a national scientific laboratory experience really produced what is a seminal moment when we think about fusion technology. In short, it took less energy to create the energy coming out of the other side. And if you think about what that really means, it changes the entire conversation that we're having here. We're literally bringing the sun to Earth. And if we can do that, then every form of energy production that we think about today, wind, solar, nuclear, fission, not fusion, oil and gas, whatever, wood, they're obsolete. They're completely obsolete at that point. And we've solved so many of the world's problems, both on production and environmental stewardship. So I just think it's a fascinating area. I'd like to see it
Quick
move forward.
follow-up before we go to our undergrads. Shortly, how do you feel about carbon capture?
How do I feel about it?
Yeah, and for both of you.
Okay. I think it's an important technology that we need to continue to develop. I'm very interested in the things I've seen coming out of companies like Occidental Petroleum around direct air capture. I think that's very important. I know that there is some environmental sensitivity around what they're going to use the carbon for, increased oil production, enhanced oil recovery, EOR, as we refer to it in the industry. But nonetheless, if we can develop the technology to capture carbon directly out of the air, and we can do that economically, I think that's one of the technologies that, again, fundamentally changes our approach to environmental stewardship, what we can and can't do with the energy sources that we have. So I'm a supporter. I do think, however, we need to change some of the regulatory construct around carbon capture, importantly, storage of carbon. We need to address that. Now, without belaboring the point too much, when I was at Sempra Infrastructure, the LNG facilities are a perfect place to capture carbon. You can capture that stream. It's a very intense carbon stream coming right off of the production facility. The question is, what do you do with it once you've captured it? And I was at the same time trying to get permits from the US EPA to store it in Louisiana where this facility was, because the geology there is perfect for permanent carbon storage. It's where our strategic petroleum reserve is. So we store oil there, we ought to store carbon there. I couldn't get the permit out of the EPA. So on the one hand, I'm being told by the government, you have to mitigate your gas emissions, but I have no place to put it. So we have to reconcile this mismatch, in my view, within the government regulatory systems that we have today. But I'm a supporter, I'm a fan.
Mr. Malbach, carbon capture?
As am I. Carbon capture is a technology that the oil and gas companies have long been using. They'll pump CO2 down into a well that's fairly well along to sort of get the remnants up. They know how to do that. They know how to cap it. I think there is a challenge at bringing that to scale. When we were at DOE, we were funding through the loan program and otherwise supporting some very large-scale carbon capture and storage projects, and they were massive industrial facilities, and the cost was very high. It was worth investing in using taxpayer dollars to sort of develop the technology, knowing that then you could iterate and try to bring the scale, the cost down. Direct air capture is very interesting. It's a form of geoengineering. I'm not a fan of most forms of geoengineering, seeding the ocean with iron filings to create algae blooms to uptake carbon, when the oceans already are on their own absorbing far more carbon than historical levels. They're already working hard. It's a delicate marine ecosystem. I wouldn't support that. Sending particulates up into the lower atmosphere, the stratosphere, to reflect sunlight back.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? Danger, Will Robinson. But direct air capture is very interesting. As if you think about, we may need some exceptional options. I think that's an interesting technology. And then yes, what do you do with the carbon? I sometimes fantasize that mountaintop removal in Appalachia and West Virginia and Kentucky, where they leveled entire mountaintops. Wouldn't it be fun to capture carbon, solidify it, and then rebuild those mountains with it?
Now we'll go down to our undergrads. Fiona, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor. And so both of you guys touched a little bit on this when you were talking about the geopolitics of energy, but I wanted to kind of focus in on Trump's calls for independence from foreign oil, yet his exclusion from of oil from raised tariffs on energy resources. So with these raised tariffs, how do you anticipate the United States' energy landscape changing, and how do you see it impacting American consumers?
Near term or long term? Both.
Both. You can touch on both.
I knew you were going to say both. Hard question. Look, I'm not a fan of tariffs, I'll say that. Just like a carbon tax, I think it increases prices in the near term for consumers. There are isolated examples, and again, I will restate, I am not a PhD economist, but I can see isolated examples where a tariff may actually reduce prices, as counterintuitive as that may be. And if you think about it, for instance, Canada, a big oil producer, and we import a lot of oil from Canada, primarily to the western states, because our refineries there are set up to refine that type of oil. But if you think about Canada, its options are somewhat limited for its oil. It's difficult to build a pipeline in Canada. So the idea that they would have the option of perhaps serving Europe or Asia with their oil production, they're somewhat limited. You look at the other side of the border and you look at our refiners, and I'm not suggesting this is an easy thing to do, so don't mistake me here. But the refiners in the United States can retool their facilities and take sweet crude from Texas. So they have options for other purchases. And when you're thinking about tariffs that way, the optionality matters. He who has or she who has the options is going to advantage themselves to that situation. If you don't have any options, you may lower your prices to maintain access to that market. So in very isolated instances, you may actually see lower prices. But I'm not a fan of tariffs. I think what they're going to do in the near term is perhaps serve some negotiation that I'm not privy to and not aware of. And I think, as I think about what's happening today in the marketplace, I think that's part of the equation. Long term, in my view, unless you have other things that accompany those price increases, i.e. tax decreases or some sort of competitive advantage where you can lower the cost of your production and lower the cost of the product to your consumer, you're probably in the long run going to be a loser. And I think that's important for us to recognize. I'm not speaking any longer for this president or this government. I'm just giving you a personal opinion, having been trained at the undergraduate level in economics, and I didn't do that well, by the way. So please don't follow my advice on economics. But that's my view.
Yeah, I don't understand the economic theory in play here. I don't understand what problem we're trying to solve. The president did declare a national energy emergency. And I think that's an interesting discussion about, is there a true emergency? What does that look like? What are we trying to solve? Somehow that's missing in this administration's approach here, is explaining to us what problems they're trying to solve, where they're headed. I think it's reasonable to be as independent as we can, but it's an interdependent world. But we've already established that we have gone from a net importer to a net exporter of oil and gas. We do 2x, we generate 2x the amount of oil over over Saudi Arabia. Natural gas, we generate something like 22% of the world's natural gas, and the next largest producer of natural gas, Russia, is half of that. So we've already, it's not 100%, but we've gone a long way. But I want to use this question to raise the issue of offshore wind. Now, offshore wind, it's a growing domestic sector. We're learning to harvest our own natural resources to produce carbon-free energy. All the current offshore wind developers who have won these state procurements to the right to build wind farms, who have bid in the wind energy area auctions at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management for the right to build these farms, they're all European oil and gas companies. So Ørsted used to be Danish Oil and Gas. Equinor used to be Statoil. Because they've been building offshore wind in Europe for several decades now, and the technology where you're going to build large offshore wind capacity out in a very harsh ocean climate, the oil and gas companies know how to do that. And they've done it successfully. They have the vessel fleets, they have the engineers, and so on and so forth. But the reason I'm bringing that up in the context of this question, Fiona, is that the states that have invited these companies to bid for the right to build their wind farms off of both coasts have insisted that increasing percentages of the parts and components come from the United States. And that has given birth to a young and rapidly growing supply chain. There are 4,200 companies across something like 46 states now that are producing these components. So there's other ways, if you really want to increase American independence, there are other ways to do it, and I would look at the offshore wind industry experience.
Mm-hmm. Jack?
Absolutely. Thank you both for being here. We've talked today a lot about decarbonization, the clean energy transition. We've talked a lot about market-based incentives from the government to spur along that transition. We haven't talked as much about government mandates, something like the Biden administration's or the state of California's rule that gas cars will not be available for sale after 2035. That's been adopted by 11 other states. Mr. Knobloch, we'll start with you. What role do you think mandates play in the clean energy transition?
I think they do have a role, as I was alluding earlier to the Clean Air Act, and those weren't, if they were only incentive-based or voluntary, we would not have made the progress that we've made. I would definitely prefer a voluntary approach. It's interesting because we're seeing here in New England some of the environmental groups opposing any investment in upgrading or extending the natural gas pipelines because they are concerned about a 30-year lock-in when they hope that we're going to transition. At the same time that our natural gas prices here in this region are twice that of any other region in the country because we're end of pipeline, because we haven't invested. And by the way, I think we need to be on top of pipeline leaks of methane in that respect. The mandate program that I'm most familiar with is one of the Department of Energy's few regulatory responsibilities is to craft energy efficiency rules for appliances, industrial equipment, lighting, heating, cooling, electronics. And when I was at DOE, President Obama, in his climate action plan, had a plank in there that directed us to strengthen the energy efficiency rules sufficient to generate 3 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalent reductions over time. The way DOE approaches these rules is you always start with a conversation with the manufacturer. And it can be a domestic manufacturer, it can be a manufacturer in another country who wants to do business in our market. And you have a conversation about what they think is possible. And then you push a bit. And you ultimately, and there's a whole formal process, you have public hearings, you have draft rule, you have final rule, and all of that. And we got that job done. We strengthened 50 rules over the 2 Obama terms. And that's saving consumers a lot. And you give the manufacturer a couple years to retool and figure it out. And then the much more efficient stuff is coming into the economy. That's saving consumers very significant money over time, and it's reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's an example where, yes, it's a mandate, but when you can, you want to work collaboratively.
Thank you. Secretary?
I'm not a big fan of consumer mandates, not at all. Kevin raised a point earlier, we were talking earlier about things like coal, sulfur oxide emissions, nitric oxide emissions, SOx and NOx, if you're a regulator. Those are known pollutants. We know what they are. And for the government to protect the citizenry by saying we're not going to emit that into the air, that's a positive mandate in my view. And it led to, as you mentioned earlier, Kevin, the reason that we can actually talk about coal at all in public is because of those types of mandates. You know, coal has been made much more clean than it was 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Yeah. But I view that as fundamentally different than telling a consumer you're not going to buy a red shirt, you're only going to buy a green shirt. We don't want you to buy blue shirts, we only want you to buy green shirts. A consumer mandate feels different to me in that regard. And in that sense, I'm much more open to a market construct, you know, where you let consumers decide what it is they want to buy. And if you make innovation a priority here in the country, the businesses that you mentioned earlier are going to innovate and produce products that are going to be much more attractive to those consumers. And just by default, you're going to end up with the same goal. You're going to end up with increased economic activity, and you're going to increase economic or environmental stewardship as we go along. I believe that because I've seen it work in the marketplace. And for that reason, I think we're starting to see some of the, you know, some of these goals that have been set, be it a 2030 goal or a 2050 goal, move back on the timetable. So, you know, governments are saying, wow, we're not going to meet this. We're not going to meet this goal at all on EVs or emissions in our state or in our country. And it's simply because they're trying to mandate to consumers what they should purchase versus some other more fundamental goal where, you know, perhaps a mandate or some sort of restriction might be applicable here.
What if we taxed red shirts but not green shirts?
We're not doing that red shirt tax that you want to do.
May I just follow up quickly? Because a great example of what the Secretary's talking about are passenger vehicle fuel efficiency standards. And because it's setting a target across the fleet. And yes, there's some delineation between SUVs, pickup trucks and minivans and everything else at passenger fleet. But when President Obama, in his first term, EPA and NHTSA increased the fuel efficiency standard for passenger vehicles from what had been around the low 20 miles per gallon to 54.2 miles, or maybe it's 52.4 miles per gallon, but a big jump. It didn't dictate technology. Now, what has happened is the auto manufacturers responded with gusto. You can get, there's 100 choices of hybrids, all EVs and plug-in hybrids in the showroom today. And a lot of them are fun and sexy and go to 0 to 60 faster than any combustion engine. They responded. And they're still building conventional internal combustion engines. But by the way, they're getting 40 miles per gallon instead of 20. So I've just offered that as an example. That nobody's mandating, and in fact, what's happening is there's a sluggish. The early responders for EVs have been there and bought their vehicles, and now because prices haven't come down fast enough, there's now a bit of a lag, and to show that you probably can't mandate consumers in this instance. The economics have to work for them.
Yeah. There are a lot of young people out here looking for possible careers. Before we go to Q&A, what role do entrepreneurs play in this landscape?
It's hard to even begin to overstate how important they are. I mentioned earlier hydraulic fracturing is a technology developed in one of the U.S. Department of Energy national laboratories. I don't think anybody in those laboratories, as smart and as brilliant as these scientists are, could have ever foreseen what George Mitchell was able to do with it in the private sector. Taking that technology out of the laboratory and putting it to practice in day-to-day life and developing the shale oil industry as they did in Texas fundamentally reshaped our energy world. But as we mentioned earlier, it fundamentally reshaped our foreign policy as well. And that was just one man's dream, to take that technology and bring it. And I can probably point to 5 or 6 different examples like that, in every sector of the economy. I remember, folks, Ross Perot, a blast from the past, talking about wind energy in a place like Texas. Are you kidding me? Texas is a national, it's an oil and gas state. Why would anybody do wind? Today, Texas is the largest wind producer in the country. And it's going to be people like that who take these technologies and bring them to market. I'll leave you with one more. We talked earlier about some of the work that's being done in quantum computing. And as this technology starts to become more and more available to people, the things that we think about today with regard to cybersecurity, passwords, anything, all of that becomes obsolete. And I will predict here right now, somebody's going to work with the National Laboratory System in Chicago, Argonne, and Fermi, and they're going to look at that technology and they're going to think of something that it can be used for, and they're going to bring it to market, and we will never have to use a password again in our life. Isn't that amazing? But that's going to be the private sector doing that. That won't be, in my opinion, a scientist in some laboratory. It's going to be one of you out in this audience who sees a business opportunity and capitalizes on it.
I think technology innovation has never been more important in this journey that we're on. If you think about the kinds of problems we're wrestling with, 25 years into this grand decarbonization experiment, they're much more stubborn, more sophisticated, more complex than when we were putting up the first wind farms and the first solar farms. We need to get more electrons on the existing grid, even as we expand the grid. We need to solve any number of challenging problems, and it's these young, early to mid-stage companies that are doing that work. It's a great place for young people to come into this industry, not only because it's long hours and all that, but because of the excitement of building a company. And I would encourage you to look. I had the privilege of heading up Greentown Labs with operations in Somerville and Houston, the largest climate tech incubator in North America. I would encourage, and there's 12, 15 major incubators across the land, and then there's another class called accelerators. They work with CEOs of these startups on a more intensive kind of boot camp kind of way. Look them up. Look at the incubators. They list the companies that are part of them. They have been vetted in order to be admitted into those incubators. And while they're with the incubators, they're getting muscled up. They typically have prototype lab space or wet lab space, machine shop, all the physical needs. They're getting skill building where they have gaps. And then the best incubators like Greentown aligns those startups with corporates who can invest in them or become customers or venture capital investors. But my main point is it's never been more important at this point. The amount of kind of systems integration and engineering and management that we need, along with technology. But another way to put it is, Charlie, we're not going to get to 100% decarbonization without real serious progress in the innovation space.
Terrific. We have two people with microphones out there, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and we will send a microphone your way.
But the hard questions go to Charlie,
Yeah, I'll send them to
just for
Nolan.
the record.
Right there.
Yeah, so I have a question related to the U.S. energy policy, and it's great to have representatives from both the side. And my question is like, what will it take the U.S. to draft an energy policy which makes America number one as far as the oil and gas production is concerned, but at the same time, lead the clean tech space? And to elaborate a bit, like if right now I'm an oil and gas CEO, no matter I hear President Trump speak drill baby drill, I'll still be hesitant what will be the situation after 4 years. And at the same time, if I'm a clean tech CEO, no matter the IRA tax credits stay there, I know what the sentiment is going around. So to cut it short, like how can we draft a policy which will make America again the number one oil and gas producer as well lead the clean tech space?
If I come up with the answer, do I get to be president or king? That's a hard question. That's a big question. Look, I think, you know, I will sort of slightly, not disagree, but challenge the premise a little bit. I think we are the world leader in both energy production and clean tech. And the reason I think that, and the reason I believe that, is because when you look at the economic data over the last 15 or 20 years, we've been able to both grow our economy and reduce our emissions at the same time. So we know it's possible. We know it's possible. And it's possible through innovation to a large degree, the technologies that we talked about up here. It's also possible by taking the incremental steps that we've agreed to take as a country. So the displacement of heavier hydrocarbons, i.e. coal with gas, leads to those emissions reductions and those better profiles that we all want. So we know how to do this, and we have done it. And I think we've done it better than perhaps any other country in the world, you know, given our scale. I was a clean energy ministerial one time with an energy minister who I won't name, but she's pounding on the table saying, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. We've done it in my country. We know it's possible. And I had to remind her, your country is smaller than the city of Houston. Of course you can do it at that scale. Try doing it at the scale of the United States or China or India or some of the bigger countries. It's much more difficult to do. But I would slightly, you know, challenge the premise. I think we have done a great job. Can we do better? Of course. Should we continue to innovate? Absolutely. And you know, I'm encouraged by what I see, not only at universities like this one, your engineering department here, your business school here, you know, your policy programs here. I'm very encouraged by what I see and what I hear. But I'm also encouraged by what I see in these laboratories. So I don't shy away from what we've done and how we've done it. Do we need to challenge ourselves with regard to long-term solutions? Yes, absolutely. The whipsaw, because of our democratic process, is problematic. You know, if you're trying to plan, as I mentioned earlier, for a 20-year, you know, power purchase agreement to build that facility that takes an enormous amount of capital, you want to minimize that risk as much as you possibly can without infringing on the constitutional rights, you know, that we're all granted as Americans. We elect politicians every 2 years in the House, every 6 years in the Senate, and every 4 years in the White House. I don't know that we want to do away with that system, but boy, sure would be nice if we had some continuity. And I think that, you know, when I think back on my term, you know, as both Deputy Secretary and Secretary, one of the most, I think, fulfilling moments for me was to look at what Kevin and Ernie Moniz did in the Obama administration around things like liquefied natural gas and LNG. Those are policies I continued as both Deputy and Secretary to provide not only the industry some continuity, but again, to my point, to the extent that natural gas was being used in developing countries around the world and displacing heavier hydrocarbons, I thought that is a good environmental, it was just good environmental stewardship. And I'm proud to say that when I left office, my successor, Jennifer Granholm, decided to continue some of the nuclear fuel programs that I talked about earlier with regard to advanced reactors. It's that type of continuity that I hope we can improve upon here in the U.S.
I like the emphasis, Dan, on continuity, and you're right. Our national leadership has been flip-flopping, and that's been a problem in terms of this. And to the extent your question is how can we do both and do it both well, I think it is commitment. It is sustained investment, sustained approach. And I would say we need to add speed and affordability. So we haven't talked a lot about, transmission today. We have this creaky old, jerry-built grid across this country, and we need to build new capacity to the solar fields in the Southwest and to the wind fields in the Upper Rockies and the Great Plains and so on and so forth. But as Dan was saying earlier, it takes years to move these permits. And it's like we have to wake up to the fact that we do have an emergency. It's a climate emergency. And we need to build this new infrastructure, including transmission, much faster. It's not that we're going to trample over the laws that are meant to protect nature and people's rights, but we can definitely do it much faster. And then on affordability, we're already seeing heating and electricity rates really pushing people's pocketbooks and the limits. We've got to dissect that and understand how can we make this transition how can we decarbonize at a more cost-effective way? Because otherwise, there will be a rejection of what we need to do and what we're trying to do.
We go over here.
Thank you guys for coming. My question kind of has to do with the current administration's energy policy. From my perspective, the current administration has declared a national energy emergency, but has pulled the plug on EV charging stations, is trying to claw back grants for renewable energy, and is firing bench scientists that do the basic research that fuels the highly profitable innovations. I know, Mr. Secretary, you said that the biggest problem facing our energy supply is lack of electrons. Do you really think this energy policy going to war against renewables advances the agenda of getting more energy into the grid?
Good question. So let me share something with you. I get the narrative. That makes some sense. There's a difference between funding basic science, blue sky science, and funding applied science. And I think some of the things that we have read about perhaps, or seen, have been cuts on the applied science side. These are technologies that are already in the marketplace and are fully functioning, to Kevin's point about offshore wind and things like that. And I think what's being cut are the direct grants and the direct subsidies. There are still tax credits in place to help those industries get off the ground. And I think generally there's support for those in the Congress, and I think there's support for those in the public. Because if you think about what a tax credit is, it's a credit that's applied to a tax that's owed. In order to have a tax that's owed, you have to have some economic activity, a profit, against which you're taxed. So from a philosophical standpoint, on the Republican side of the aisle, that makes some sense. You first have to create the economic activity, you owe a tax, and then you apply a credit to it to reduce or mitigate that tax owed. So I think there's support for that. With regard to, opposing or supporting renewable energy for the production of electrons, I'll point back to the high water mark for the installation of solar and wind technology or capacity here in the United States. Anybody want to dare guess when that was, when we reached the high water mark? It was 2019, when I was the Deputy Secretary of Energy under a Trump administration. Not many people know that, but we've gone downhill since then from 2019. And I think it's important to recognize those efforts. Is he correct? Is the Trump administration taking the correct approach on all renewable technologies? Probably not. But no administration has. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that there's a flat-out opposition to that. And the reason I say that is because it's important for us to distinguish the difference between rhetoric and reality. And I don't know what it takes to get elected in the United States. I've never run for public office. I have no intention of running for public office. There are certain days I wake up, I don't know why anybody in their right mind would do it.
I ran for Congress on the carbon tax. I lost.
Oh, that's why you're here? Is that why you're here?
That's why I'm here, yeah.
Jeez, that's good to know. That's good to know. No, I think there's a distinction between what people say on the as an American to stand in the Oval Office and listen to a lot of intense conversation about these types of issues and these types of policies. And I will tell you that the person I saw as President of the United States back then in 2019, 2020 is a fundamentally different person in the Oval Office than sometimes what you see on a campaign trail, as is every politician. No politician is immune from that, in my opinion, having worked on Capitol Hill, both sides, Senate and House, and obviously being a part of the executive branch. So I think, you know, as we think about this as Americans, as we head into the next election, as we think about what we want to do with our careers, I think it's important that we have that very transparent, rational, thoughtful conversation about energy policy and not simply react to something that might be more emotional on a certain day.
It's a really interesting question, and it kind of focuses us on what's the role of government in incubating, encouraging new industries, new technologies when it's in the public interest. Is there a public policy need here? And I would argue yes. If you look at, again, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, very, generational scale in public investment in newer, cleaner technologies, which I think is fully justified. And I brought my cheat sheet because I wanted to quote a new American Clean Power study that they commissioned, looking at the IRA tax credits and the projected impact on the economy. And they're projecting $1.9 trillion economy growth as a result of those tax credits over the next 10 years, a 4x return on the taxpayer dollars with private investment coming in, 13.7 million jobs, et cetera, et cetera. However, the idea isn't to subsidize these sectors for all time. The point should be get them on their feet and let them run and start to commercialize and generate revenue without public subsidy. And you often hear this debate around, are we still subsidizing the oil and gas sector? And in some ways we are with depreciated allowance and this and that. That's a reasonable discussion to look at that public investment. And I don't think, wind and solar should be receiving public subsidies forever. There should be a taper down period. Again, you're trying to kind of give birth, sustain, ability for these industries to take root and grow, produce jobs, produce tax benefits for communities, produce wealth. And anyway, I just wanted, I saw that study.
That's a good way to put it, Kevin, because I think that's really the debate that we're having here. Yeah. It's not for or against a certain technology. We're talking about a timing question. We're debating the time period for some of these tax credits or some of these subsidies or grants or whatever. And I think that's a legitimate debate to have, yeah. To go back and forth on that. And I think that's what we're seeing to some degree. Now, some, articulate that better than others, but nonetheless, that's the conversation that we're having because, as we think about this, an electron is an electron. An electron doesn't know if it was produced by a windmill, a nuclear generator, a natural gas generation facility. It doesn't know if it's green, blue, red, purple, doesn't matter. An electron's an electron. A molecule is a molecule. So those are legitimate debates for us to have.
And can I get agreement between the two of you that the bench science, the pure science, the lack of applied science is something that is important for government to fund?
Applied science?
Applied, no, not applied science, the pure science.
Oh, basic science.
Basic
science. No,
yeah.
absolutely. No, absolutely. I'm a full supporter of what I've seen the government do, not only at DOE, but other government agencies. But I can speak to DOE because I've lived it for a while. The work that's being done on the blue sky side, if you will, for lack of a better, is incredible. I mean, they're thinking about the world in ways that I could not have imagined thinking about it. I mean, we talked about electrons today and electricity production. I've seen experiments at bench scale where they're beginning to move electrons without a wire. What does that do to the entire infrastructure conversation in the United States? If you can move an electron from New York to LA with no in-between infrastructure, think about that, much like your cellular phone today. Those are the types of things that I think we need to encourage because they're not the types of projects that you're going to see private industry take on. It's just too risky. So for me, that's an appropriate role for government, and I'd like to see that continued, if not increased.
I know I really came away from my time at DOE really impressed by, people don't think of DOE as a science agency.
That's right.
And yet DOE has 17 national labs. 4 of them are national security labs, nuclear nuclear weapons and related security, and the rest are working on solving, these big energy problems. And they're conducting big science that no individual company would ever have the money for. So the big atom smashers, the synchrotrons, the photon research, that pharmaceutical companies can get rent a line on them and so on. It's really cool. Mm-hmm. And DOE is a science agency and may well be the largest one.
All right, I think we have time for one more. Send the mic out somewhere. All right, right in the front.
Remember, if it's a hard one, Charlie. No one.
You both talked a little bit about permitting reform as a really vital next step for moving forward with energy, to kind of reconcile the slow timeline with the quick need for more innovation and projects. And I think there was a bill in the last legislative session that had some bipartisan support, but then kind of lost traction. Could you speak a little bit about why permitting reform is so important, what the conflict around it has been in Congress so far, and how we might still see a path for it going forward?
Want to start? You want to start?
Okay. It's really needed. When I came out of the Department of Energy in 2017, I had the chance I wanted to learn the business end of clean energy, and I went to work for an independent transmission developer. And I had the lead in New York State developing offshore wind transmission projects. And first, we quickly found ourselves advocating for thinking about that whole, bringing offshore wind to shore more holistically with an organized mesh grid instead of one-off. But that whole interconnection process is bananas. It takes years, and transmission developers have to pony up ultimately millions of dollars before they put a shovel in the ground to go through that process. Now, there's important parts of that process. It should be community hearings, and we should be looking at impact on neighborhoods and all of that. That's all important. But you can do that more efficiently. And I think the legislation you're talking about, Senator Manchin from West Virginia was a key architect of that. You had this classic situation where a number of the large environmental communities didn't like it because they felt like it was going to allow oil and gas to accelerate their production development. And I think some on the right maybe were concerned about accelerating renewables. But the reality is, as we've established, we're living in a world where we're going to need these fossil molecules for some period of time as demand grows. And I would have taken that deal. Let's shorten permitting for renewable energy, battery storage, and so on.
Yeah. It's a complicated question. I mean, there's a lot of different things in play here. Part of it is just the whole federalism debate. Is the state going to have, predominance on the decision, as to whether something is cited in their state, or is it going to be the federal government through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission or the EPA mandating to a state, you will build this for whatever reason, is important at the time. So there's that tension between governors and the executive branch of the government. And the issues at the state level are all over the maps. I mean, land use issues for things like solar and wind become very intense. The production of oil and gas in someone's backyard, a pipeline right of way through private property. All of these issues come to fore. And the fundamental question at play most of the time is just who's going to make the decision. Is it going to be a federal agency or is it going to be a local agency? And finding the balance there is very, very difficult. It can also involve things, that obviously relate to finances. I'm from Louisiana, so there's a lot of offshore production off the coast of Louisiana. Who shares in that royalty? The production of that land, it's argued, creates some environmental concerns with regard to coastal erosion. When you're moving ships in and out of these, small canals to move the oil or gas, whatever it is you're producing. Who pays for that? And how is it paid for? So, these questions really do get heated at times. I do think they took an important first step when they were doing the budget bill or the debt limit bill at one point. They added some language. I don't think they went quite far enough for either the full Congress or, frankly, the industry. And I'm hopeful that they'll do some incremental steps. And I'll just give you one quick example of that. The National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, as we refer to it in Washington. Under some circumstances, you might have 1, 2, 3, perhaps 4 different federal agencies conducting NEPA reviews to develop environmental impact statements. Do you really need 4 different agencies? Do you need to go stand in line 4 different times to get your permit, to get your driver's license? Would you go to 4 separate MVA stations, or whatever it's called here in New Hampshire, just to get a license? The answer is probably no. We have enough coordination at the governmental level that we can probably rely upon one technically competent agency. Maybe it's the Department of Energy with the national laboratories. Maybe it's the Environmental Protection Agency. And once you've achieved that, then the rest of the process should be somewhat easier. And today it just isn't. You may spend literally tens of millions of dollars just on lawyers to go from agency to agency to agency to get the same permit. We can refine that. We can make that more efficient.
Terrific.
Secretary Brouillette, thank you. Mr. Noblock, thank you very much for being here. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists, please.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think I speak for everyone on stage and hopefully in the audience when saying that this was a fascinating conversation. I think we all learned a lot. Thank you, Professor Whelan, for moderating this, and for all of our faculty sponsors. We have another 100 Days program on April 16th. It's on bipartisan bills. We'll be bringing 2 Dartmouth grads and former members of Congress, Annie Kuster and Alex Mooney. Annie Kuster was our representative actually in Congress for a couple of years. So we look forward to that program. Thank you again. Thank you especially to Devora and Madison with the Rockefeller Center, everyone else who helped put this together. It would not have been possible without you.
Thank you all.
Very good. Thank you.